Hey there. If you thought last week was a little bit on the quieter side, there weren't many planet to planet aspects, although there was that Mars square Uranus that really helped to kick off the energy of warfare. This week ahead has loads going on. Not only do we have the lunar eclipse tomorrow in the sign of Virgo, but we've got 2 sign changes this week. So we've got Mars going into Pisces. We've also got Venus going into Aries. Venus is the star of the show this week because not only does she go into Aries, but she's also making a sextile to Uranus. She's also making a conjunction to Neptune and also a conjunction to Saturn, which is pretty big news. But we've also got a Mercury Cazimi that's also retrograde. All this during Mercury's retrograde as well. So it's a pretty big week. So what I'm going to do in this video is just pace you through some of the things to be aware of. I'll tell you a little bit about Mars in Pisces and also, Venus going into Aries and what I think, may well occur there. And of course, a little bit of information about the lunar eclipse. Now, if this is the first time you've come to Feel Good Astrology, hi, my name's Louisa. Welcome. I try to deliver astrology in such a way that people feel a little bit of support. I really think right now most people need a bit of support. It's not very easy to navigate what's going on in the world. You could be absolutely forgiven for feeling a little bit on the confused side from time to time because things really, really aren't clear. This is just a huge, huge time. So let's get cracking. Let's have a look at what's coming up and see what we can make of it. So the first thing that I wanted to really sort of point out is that we're really building this week ahead on the bones of the aspects from last week. And what I mean by that in particular is this Mars and Uranus square. So this Mars and Uranus square really came in last week and we really felt the full force of it. Mars is absolutely about taking action and defending our boundaries. And in the sign of Aquarius, it was very much focused on everyone, our brothers and sisters, the idea of social values. And so, one of the things that people were considering last week would have been, where is it okay to physically defend your social boundaries? Where is it okay to defend under a moral guise? Where is it okay for us to do that? And of course, Uranus in the sign of Taurus is asking us about resources. So things like not just money and banking and things like that, but also about resources like petrol, food goods, gas, the flow of water, the flow of resources in general, and also land. Now, Uranus, in many ways shows where things have been put online, where things have been digitized, so a lot of currency that, we, might hear people talk about is digital. Most of it doesn't actually physically exist. And yet, our banks and our, what are they called? Stocks and shares and trading and stuff, this goes on and it appears to have real value. And yet Uranus is not a very stable planet at all. Like Uranus is about the change. Uranus is about the spontaneity and the shock. And Uranus is a bit like a whirlwind or a tornado. It really shakes things thoroughly. It shakes the bones of things. It shakes off anything that's really not necessary. And so, we've got this ongoing square between Mars and Uranus coming, that started from a position of social values and morality. The idea of, my values are more important than your values, or I see these values are more important for the benefit of humanity than these values. And also we're talking about the flow of resources and what might be going on there. And also the sharing of land. Uranus actually, funnily enough, is one of the rulers of Aquarius. So, there's definitely an Aquarian theme. And so, there's shock around that. Now, that may well have also been touching your life. So, obviously there's the very sort of abstracted level, where we might be seeing things on news or internet feeds, especially things that are shocking, because Uranus is absolutely about the shock, but Uranus also rules things that are online. And Mars is very quick. Uranus is very quick acting. So I do think there's something much bigger going on behind the scenes that's there to shock, to anger, to make people consider moral relativism and the rights that we might have to defend ourselves or to defend boundaries based on moral reasons. The fact that it's ongoing, I think, is going to absolutely influence the flow of resources and how people might have access to resources. I believe is it Hormuz Straits are blocked right now. So we may well be finding in different countries that the flow of resources that we might use in our day-to-day lives are being suppressed or held back. There's all sorts of different things. There's ramifications that are going to be, we'll be living through for as long as they take to work their way out. It's interesting, as we start this week ahead, and I apologize that I didn't do this yesterday. I've had, funnily enough, Mercury retrograde issues, cameras breaking, not being able to download things, certain permissions just there's been all sorts of different things going on, funnily enough, online. As we start this, the moon is coming into a massive T-square. Now, given that the moon is also in a run-up to the lunar eclipse, this will be the second eclipse of the year, the first lunar eclipse. What that means is it's a full moon eclipse. But given that the moon is leading up to this eclipse, the moon is very, very full moony. The moon is, when I think of a full moon, I might think of like lunatics and hysterics, people being out of their minds or people not being in their full grounded consciousness. People are stirred and stirrable. And so seeing that the moon is coming into an exact opposition with Mars, and on the way, the moon is going to be making an exact square to Uranus, I do think we're going to be hearing more about what's going on in the Middle East and most likely in other areas. I'm absolutely certain of it. And also, I would also consider what's going on in your own life, whereby you feel like your own values and your ability to talk freely about your values, whilst also rocking your stability. I think those kinds of discussions are also on the table right now. And so that is an ongoing theme. If you're finding this is coming up for you, there's a reason for it, because this is what the planets are really showing us. Now, I do also just want to put into this conversation the idea that we've still got this ongoing trine from Uranus and Pluto. So, whenever I'm looking at astrology, I'm always looking at the layers. It's never just one aspect that starts something. There'll be, like, I guess if you look at a wedding cake, it will have a layer of cake. It might have some buttercream, some tasty buttercream, have another layer of cake. It might have some kind of lucky trinket or something buried in between. I don't even know what those things are. I had a cheesecake, like a massive cheese one. But anyway, it will also have marzipan or whatever it's called in your country, followed by some icing. And it's all of those layers that make that wedding cake. And similarly, like Uranus and Mars aren't the causes of a war or what would appear to be a war. Underneath this, for months, we've had aggravation between Pluto and Uranus. Now, I say aggravation. Pluto and Uranus have been in a trine for ages. Now, trines are usually experienced as things working together. But, we need to consider what are those energies. So Pluto, absolute power. So there is an energy of absolute power that has been working to explore resources and the sharing of resources from all different aspects, and potentially the cutting off of resources and the reallocation of resources, and also the tokenization of resources. So if you think about what's gone on over definitely the last 18 months or so, as this was starting to come in and then coming into a really, exact, an exact trine, this is going to be going on for quite a while longer. Governments, not just one government, I'm not talking about one side is doing this. Every perceivable side will be working on their own version of how we tokenize resources or digitize them or make everything a commodity online, like the Internet of Things. It's all going on behind the scenes, and it's associated with big power. We've also got these sextiles, from Pluto to Saturn, Pluto to Neptune, and then from Uranus to Saturn and Uranus to Neptune. All four of these have been working together for months, and here we've got the energy of the big like the big power. I heard someone describe it as a supra governance, like a governance behind actual governments. And so, you've got the super or behind the scenes governance working with its foot soldiers. That's Saturn here. And then Neptune, we've got, media and the distortion. Saturn and Neptune, as they were coming into a conjunction together, I thought of them with a good friend, an astrologer friend, Alexandra. We were talking about this as being a portal of distorted communication or distorted information. So Neptune and Saturn have been, the space between them has been distorted information that's been disseminated everywhere with the help of Uranus and also with the help of big power. And so all of this has been mounting together, and then Mars comes into the picture, and there's something else. And this is not just Mars in a square to Uranus, but it's Mars in a square to Uranus in between two powerful eclipses. So it's no surprise that things have been kicking off. Really, it isn't. So yeah, I do think things are going to probably get disruptive behind the scenes. But again, as ever, I want to bring this back down to what's going on for you right now. How have you been changing your life? What have all of these aspects been doing to you? Because right now, what you've been building on layer by layer by layer is becoming enlivened. It's starting to have a life of its own. And there may well be some shocks in here. In particular, Uranus and Mars is shocking us into a more independent way of being, whereby we take responsibility for our behaviors. Like shit gets real, and we start to sort of really take, like, we own our shit, to use that word again. Mars here working in a semi-sextile to Saturn and also Neptune is really, really strong. So yeah, there's lots going on. Now, this lunar eclipse is going to be stirring things up. Now, if you have a tendency to be hypercritical and judgmental, you may well find this moon really stirs that up. So you may well find that you're having very strong reactions about people. But like, if we think about it, most likely if you're having strong reactions about people is because you hold yourself to a very high level of scrutiny as well. So, the moon coming into Virgo is likely to bring out the inner critic in everyone. And, right now that inner critic is very, very unbalanced. Look at all these planets on this side. These planets here in particular, between Pluto and Saturn, they're really encouraging us to kind of step out of our physical life and into the big world story. And like, here's the thing, like, we're told about World War I and II, and obviously I wasn't there, though some might think I'm a bit of a dinosaur, in my middle age. But, like, these world wars, just by their name, it's implied that everybody was involved in a world war. But there would have been thousands, hundreds of people, maybe millions of people who absolutely weren't affected by World War, and that World War was a war between certain countries in certain parts of the world, and there are other parts that were really kind of, not really getting involved. Similarly, I think there are things going on right now that we feel involved in, and media, which has been absolutely, and social media and celebrity and the rise of the internet. So Uranus, as one of the planets I would associate with the internet, and also Neptune, that has been in Pisces for a long time. It isn't now, it's just moved over to Aries, but they have and then Pluto in Aquarius again. This is all about sort of social media and a different kind of consciousness, like this collective consciousness. There is this huge amount of energy right now in the place of collective consciousness. And so with this unbalancing of planets, we could absolutely feel completely destabilized and out of our sovereignty in our physical body, in our physical reality, where we can actually make a physical difference. But we could be fretting, which is a real Virgo thing, by the way. We could be fretting and worrying and wondering, like, what can we do? What do we have to do? If we do this, will this change? We could be in this place of continuous mind whirring around. Now, with all these Pisces planets, really what we're encouraged to do is to come into surrender, recognize what we can change and recognize what we can't. And then what we can't change, make peace with it. And then what we can't change and what we have to make peace with, then you might consider, okay, I've made peace with it. Now what? Now how can I live? And so I do think there are some very different choices that are really becoming very stark. It feels like, with all this Pisces energy, there is this energy of surrender. But do I mean surrender as a weakness? No, I don't. And Mars coming into Pisces, I'll talk about that in a sec. This isn't a passive surrender necessarily, but with the lunar eclipse in the sign of Virgo, not only do I think, we will be fighting over natural resources and really considering our natural resources. And some of us will be absolutely thinking, do you know what? I just want to manage the land. I want to be on a homestead. I want to be doing my own thing. I want to be disconnecting from all of this rubbish. I need my own space. I need my own clarity. But you absolutely need to watch that you're not taking this too personally, that you're not scrutinizing yourself in an unfair way. And desperately try not to self-sabotage. Now, if we go to, I just want to touch on these two planets, so Venus in Aries and also Mars in Pisces, just to see if this adds in an extra layer. Because Mars in Pisces, they've got very, very different energies. It would make so much more sense if we were talking about Venus in Pisces, which, Venus is exalted in the sign of Pisces, because, the Pisces energy, spiritual union, imagination, surrender, compassion, fantasy, and Venus, which is all about relatedness, they go really beautifully together. But Mars, the planet of action, defending boundaries, doesn't really mix in very easily with surrender. I mean, they appear to be coming from very different perspectives. But the spiritual union, at the highest level, I think, we're able to take action at a spiritual level. So our instinct is strong. We have a creative stamina. We are, talking about sexuality, this also represents our real life, and Mars is a very sexual planet, by the way. I think when we're in our present consciousness and we're not worrying and like worrying in the future or fretting about the past, when we're in our actual presence, in our actual being, and are at one with ourselves, I think there's going to be a very physical healing going on. Mars is going to be very present in that moment, and he will be able to take action within your body. I also think, if you think Pisces is about the tides and the ocean, Mars movement is very straight ahead, one direction. Like, this is where I'm heading. Don't try to stop me, because if you get in my way, I'm going to have to push you off. But, Mars here is going to be moving with the tides. So movement is not going to be so obvious. Sometimes our mode of transport or our direction in life, just while Mars is in the sign of Pisces, is going to go on these diversions. And maybe that's what's needed, to go with the flow in a real sort of active and strong way, in a trusting way. The shadow of this is the sort of passive aggression that can come up, with the sort of Pisces energy, which is I'm not ready to make a decision. I can't quite, I'm sitting on the fence. I don't want to hurt anyone. That's the sort of real negative version of Pisces. But then the aggression of Mars, I mean, that could absolutely bring that out. We've also got potential martyrs. The martyr energy is going to be very, very strong. And escapism. So all boundaries are going to get blurry. Now, given that Pisces can represent fantasy, wouldn't surprise me if some of the boundaries that people are fighting about right now are kind of made up. They're fantastical. So we might find out some of these things, not just in one way politically. I think that is going to be something that's repeated in many different ways. There are many different threads. And yeah, the exhaustion, Pisces can be a very sort of exhausting sign if you've got lots in the sign of Pisces, in particular, softer things like the moon or even Mars. That's not soft, but, Mars in Pisces can get very exhausted very quickly. So, we could absolutely burn out. This is why we really don't need to worry. Even though this is a time when we might choose to worry, I recommend we don't. We do what we can to manage our mental health, because we need to keep our full physical strength up there. Mars in Pisces is showing we get our best strength from our connection to our body, but also our connection to the veils, through the veils, when we see ourselves as an omnipresent person. And so this is, I act from spirit, not from force. You're clear, you're taking clear spiritual action. Maybe you're giving yourself clear spiritual boundaries. Maybe you're doing clear spiritual protection work. Maybe your best form, if you want to be active in terms of trying to sway what's going on politically around the world, maybe your best course of action right now is to work on the etheric level and to imagine protective energies in particular places. Now, if we contrast that with Venus into Aries, like Venus is about love and flow and abundance. She's definitely about well-being. I think, Mars is yangy, so he's sort of like direct. Venus is wide open. She's about receiving. She's about allowing. And she's very much about how we relate to others. What are we going to do with other people? And of course, Aries is a sign of initiation. We've already spoken a little bit about the directness of Mars, which rules Aries. So it's about taking action, being bold, impatient, independent. The sign of Aries really flavors planets in that way. On the most purposeful side of this, we might feel very fearless and passionate, like we feel empowered to do things, especially if it relates to other people. We're going to initiate things in our relationships. We might just allow ourselves to be a bit vulnerable, and there's strength in that vulnerability, strength in that sharing. I don't think this is a needy love that we might have for each other. This is coming from a place of ownership. I own my crap, putting it on the table. I own it. I'm going to take responsibility for it. You don't need to do that. I'm going to do it for myself. I mean, that's quite a sexy thing, isn't it? To be with somebody who can deal with their own life and then meet you in the middle. And I think that's what we're talking about here. So we're joining from desire, not from need. We're joining from a place of allowance and want, but not from need. The shadow side of this is we could get very bored very quickly with our mate and get very impatient. And so I don't think we're going to be as potentially relational as we might be. We might be a bit more short-tempered. And, you might ask yourself, well, where is that showing up in my life right now? Where am I flying off the handle and not really listening as much? We might also get quite competitive with the people that we love and really react because of this. And so it's something else to watch out for. But ultimately, the sort of best version of this is allowing what you want, really tuning in on what your highest and good is, and then standing for it and allowing it. Again, if you're doing that whilst energizing things from a place of spirit, it's much more likely to work. So I think these two are going hand in hand as we look at this week ahead. Some final thoughts then. at the end of the week, so Saturday and Sunday, we've got the Mercury Cazimi, which is retrograde. I see that as a day of breakthroughs. And then Venus making an exact conjunction with Neptune and also Saturn. We are really resetting our relationships, and we could be resetting them into more of an unconditional relationship, and then double it down with some structures underneath. So really, I think, there's a breakthrough, especially if you've got something going on with relationships. How can my relationships to my partner get better, to my kids get better, to my community get better, to my customers, to my governments, if we believe in them, to the world, to humanity? That's a good question. Like, how can I serve humanity, or how can I stand with humanity, or how can I love humanity a bit more? How can I forgive everyone within humanity, if that's what floats your boat? It floats mine, actually. How can I do that? Mercury retrograde Cazimi could absolutely be bringing you those brain waves. And then, once you've got those ideas kind of boom, 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 like shooting into your brain, Venus in a conjunction to Neptune is absolutely standing for forgiveness and compassion and this unconditionality. So I think something could arise that could be very, very beneficial. And then, once you've sort of big pictured it and scoped it out, or created it in your mind's eye, created it in your heart, created it etherically, as something that is possible. Then, on the Sunday, there's the energy of Venus in a conjunction to Saturn to concretize it, to bring it in, to stabilize it, to materialize it. So there you go. They are my thoughts for the week ahead. If you want to know on a breakdown, like a broken down version on a day-by-day basis, including all the moon placements, and you'll see I do that here at the bottom here. I talk about where the moon is as well. If you would like those, then just scan the QR code above, or go to www.school, that's skool.com/feelgoodastrology, and join my free community. There's loads of content there, and that's where I do my daily updates and more besides. There's lots going on there. So maybe I'll see you there, maybe not, who knows, but I'll catch you next time. I'm sure of that. Lots of love. Bye for now.